let's check out what I'm currently reading. You can read along if you like. So, today I'm reading from Shashi Tharoor's Bookless in Baghdad, which is a collection of essays. Shashi Tharoor is a prolific writer, essayist, also a diplomat, and he wears many hats. The committed poet, Pablo Neruda, remembered. The centenary of the birth of the great Chilean poet Pablo Neruda on 12th July 2004 has passed, but how can any writer allow it to pass unremarked? It is not merely the Nobel Prize for Literature that he won in 1971 that marks Neruda as one of the greatest literary figures of the last century. It is surely the extent to which his life and his poetry live on in the souls of readers everywhere, most particularly in the Spanish speaking world, but also thanks to some excellent translation across the globe as well. Neruda's poetry illuminates the Spanish language, its lines cited, its sentiments absorbed to a greater extent than, say, Eliot's in English. His passion, his rage, his tenderness, his wit are as familiar and beloved to literate Hispanics as Tagore's to Bengalis. And unlike most poets, Neruda was a man of action, serving his country as a diplomat and a politician, always willing to put his life and limb at the service of his convictions. The combination gave him a following few writers have ever known in their lifetimes. One of my favorite stories about Neruda is of the time in his early 60s when he was addressing an audience in a Latin American country and was asked by a fan to recite a particular poem. Neruda started doing so and faltered. The poem had been written many years earlier, and his own memory was no longer so reliable. As the aging poet stood on the stage, stumbling for his half forgotten words, a man rose from the audience and recited the next line. Then another got up to join him, and another, and soon the entire audience was on its feet, reciting the poem as its author stood silent and humbled, listening to his poetry coming back to him through the voices and the hearts of his readers. Neruda, the son of a railroad worker, published his first poem at 13. He was only 16, an age when many of us are barely growing out of short pants, when he decided that the name he was born with, Ricardo Eleazar Neftali Reyes Basso Alto, would not do for him. He chose instead to rename himself Pablo, a simple Spanish name already being made famous by the great painter Picasso. Neruda, after the Czech writer Jan Neruda, whom he greatly admired. Within 4 years, he had already published a book of poetry that stunned the world, 20 love poems and a song of despair. 8 decades of lovers since then have romanced each other with the lines written by a 20-year-old. 29 more volumes were to follow. Though Pablo Neruda entered his country's diplomatic service, poetry has never been a generous paymaster. From Love to an Evocative Humanism in Residence on Earth, 1933, through the powerful and deceptively simple Elementary Odes, 1958, Neruda sparkled with a brilliance that was both fierce and memorable. He was, it must be said, a writer engagé. His politics was not merely leftist, he was a committed communist. And though it seems awkward to admit it today, after all we know of the Soviet strongman's cruelties, avowedly Stalinist. His political convictions were really forged, like those of so many others at the time, in the crucible of the Spanish Civil War. Neruda had, after minor consular posts in Asia and Argentina, been assigned to Spain in 1934, just as tensions between the Republicans and the fascists were beginning to reach boiling point. His postings in places like Colombo and Rangoon had already awakened his consciousness of the perverse inequities of colonialism, and he had even been boycotted by British society in Burma for his heretical views. The boycott, he wrote, couldn't have pleased me more. Those intolerant Europeans were not really interesting. I had not come to the Orient to spend my life with transient colonizers, but with the ancient spirit of the world. When his friend and great Spanish poet Federico Lorca was murdered by the fascists in August 1936, Neruda crossed the Rubicon. Not only did he write his classic poem about the war, Spain in My Heart, but he intervened to save the lives of some 2,000 leftist refugees by transporting them by sea to Chile. Neruda's official role in the evacuation as a diplomat was matched by his passionate self justification in his poetry. In a powerful poem, Let Me Explain a Few Things, Neruda traced his own change from the romantic who had authored love poems to the committed writer of the world's wrongs. You will ask why his poetry does not speak of dreams and leaves, he wrote, and then he provided the ringing answer. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Diplomacy was clearly not going to be enough for someone with such a seething passion for justice, and Neruda resigned his diplomatic position as Chilean consul general in Mexico City in 1940. He delighted in returning home. I believe a man should live in his own country, he wrote in his memoirs. I think the deracination of human beings leads to frustration in one way or another, obstructing the light of the soul. Having given up diplomacy, he entered politics, being elected as a senator in 1945. The year he also formally joined the Communist Party. Even those of us who see little to commend in communism as an ideology or the Communist Party as an institution cannot fail to be moved by the direct simplicity of his poem To My Party. Far from the jargon-laden propaganda of the usual Marxist tracts, Neruda's poem soars in its vision. You have given me brotherhood towards the man I do not know. You have given me the added strength of all those living. You showed me how one person's pain could die in the victory of all. You have made me indestructible, for I no longer end in myself. Through Neruda's magnificent words, it is easier to understand how so many young idealists at the time found inspiration in his communist solidarity. A clash with Chile's tyrannical rulers was inevitable. After a passionate denunciation of the government in a Venezuelan newspaper, no Chilean paper was prepared to publish it, was followed by a courageous speech in the Senate accusing the authorities of running a concentration camp. Neruda was forced to go into hiding in 1948. He lived underground protected by friends for a year before fleeing Chile in disguise in a bold horseback ride across the mountains to Argentina, during which he nearly perished. He made it, after a couple of harrowing episodes, carrying with him a precious manuscript of poems, Canto General. There followed 3 years of exile in Europe, part of which was recently immortalized in the marvelous Italian film The Postman, though it omitted his once having to escape arrest by fleeing on a gondola in Venice. On his return to Chile, Neruda remained actively political and was even nominated for the presidency of his country. He stepped aside for his friend Salvador Allende, who was finally elected in 1970 and named Neruda his ambassador to France. Ill health prompted the poet-diplomat to return home in late 1972. It was there that Neruda followed in anguish the coup that toppled Allende's government. As a prominent communist, Neruda was raided by the military on his deathbed, but was spirited enough to say to the commander who marched into his bedroom, "There is only one thing of danger for you here, my poetry." 12 days after the fall of the Allende government, Pablo Neruda died. His body lay for 2 days in his house, which had been ransacked by soldiers, and his funeral became the occasion for perhaps the only spontaneous popular demonstration against the military dictatorship. In his memorable poem, The Heights of Machu Picchu, he had written of the permanence of that durable Inca rock fortress, the rock that abides, and the word. But now it would be of Neruda himself that the next lines spoke. Death's plentitude holding us here, a bastion, the fullness of life like a blow falling. In his poem, The Poet's Obligation, Neruda had declared, to whoever is not listening to the sea this Friday morning, to whoever is cooped up, in house or office, factory or woman, or street or mine, or dry prison cell, to him I come, and without speaking or looking, I arrive and open the door of his prison. Those prison doors will always remain open to anyone who can pick up a volume of Neruda's. His biographer, Adam Feinstein, recounts how one morning soon after his death, there was an uproar in a house where Neruda had used to live. A huge eagle had got into the living room, though all the doors and windows of the house had been locked for months. Pablo Neruda had always said that in his next life he wanted to be an eagle. No doubt his wish was fulfilled, and he soars above us today, like his poetry.